Welcome back to History 120 and our discussion of the American Revolution this week. All right, so the die has been cast. We've declared independence. We have signed a document declaring before the world all of our reasons for leaving Great Britain and seeking independence. And now we need to back it up. The American colonists need to deal with the British Army. If we're going to win this war of independence, we need to actually fight. So, following the withdrawal from Boston at the end of the Siege of Boston, the British Army and Navy had retreated back up to Canada, where the loyal, good British subjects are. In July of 1776, the British return. And they return with a vengeance by invading New York and essentially threatening New York City, which capitulates real quick because it's never meant a buck that it didn't enjoy, and the British pound spends easily. New York City is not a hotbed of independence and pushing for independence. They actually had been one of the colonies that opposed independence. But what we get with the invasion of New York by the British is the near disintegration of Washington's army at Brooklyn Heights, at the Battle of Harlem Heights, several places across New York and the areas surrounding New York City. The British Army handily defeats the rebels. The army begins to fall apart. People who are local militia, hey, I'm a Massachusetts militiaman, I didn't sign up to fight for New York, they leave. They see that we're getting beat, there's no sense in me being around, I'm just going to die uselessly, so I'm going to go home. And the army begins to fall apart. And Washington is charged with holding this army together, because if the army disintegrates, then there will be no United States, there will be no new country, all of this will be in vain, and the British will be back with a vengeance. And what's interesting is the enlistments by the various state militias were for 1 year. So many of these men had signed up on January 1st, 1776, and their enlistment period was very rapidly drawing to an end right after all of these defeats. And what ultimately happens is that Washington comes up with a plan. He has a very small army, and he can't take on all of the British army at once with this small ragtag band. But there are little outposts, little towns held by the British army and their Hessian allies that they can take, that they can deal with. And if Washington can keep his army together long enough, maybe he can win a victory. And a victory will do so much for morale that these soldiers will stay around. They'll reenlist. Maybe more will come. And maybe this rebellion has a chance. And so in December of 1776, Washington and his men march out from New York and their camps around New York, and they march on New Jersey. They march towards Trenton. This is where Washington crosses the Delaware, not heroically as we see in the 19th century painting that has nothing to do with reality, but he gets his army divided into thirds and across the river. They reform on the outskirts of Trenton, New Jersey. And they're actually behind schedule. Washington had wanted to attack before dawn, and now all of a sudden it's 6, 7 o'clock. The sun is coming up. It's Christmas morning in New Jersey, and there's this Hessian outpost, Hessian soldiers garrisoning the city of Trenton. And that morning, as these soldiers who had spent the night before drinking and singing and carousing and being homesick because it's Christmas Eve night, 1776, and they kind of wish they were at home, but this is where the check pays the bank. The American army with Washington at its lead appears on the edge of town. And the Germans aren't ready, and the Hessians are so quickly and easily defeated that Washington has this glorious victory that he's needed. And he repeats it a few days later at the Battle of Princeton. And we have these two glowing highlights, these two momentous surprise victories at the end of 1776, and they're really the only high point militarily for the colonies that year. The next year, campaigning again does not go well for the Americans. One thing we need to realize, once the battles of Trenton and Princeton take place, both armies go into winter camps. You can't move and fight an army in the 18th century during the winter. And so the war essentially stops for 3 and 4 months at a time. And then we go back to a game of cat and mouse. Washington trying to find a way to pick his battles. He knows he can't take the British Army head on every time and beat them. He just has to hold out. He just has to hold out long enough. In September of 1777, the British defeat the American garrisons around Philadelphia, and the city of Philadelphia, the titular capital of these colonies, falls and is captured by the British. And again, it looks like things are going to be very, very dark. And that fall, a British general by the name of Gentleman Johnny Burgoyne comes up with a plan. We need to divide the colonies in two. We need to split the colonies, and that will make it easier to deal with the separate armies, and the armies won't be able to reinforce each other, and the British will be able to defeat these erstwhile rebels. And so Burgoyne comes up with the idea of having one army group positioned with naval support at New York City, which the British hold, and one at the other end of the Hudson River, which leads straight up from New York City, cuts the colonies in half, cuts the state of New York in half, and the British hold forts at the Canadian side of the Hudson, so far away. And if the British Army can move up the Hudson from New York City and down the Hudson from Canada, one group coming up the river, one group marching overland, they can defeat Washington's army summarily. They can win this rebellion with minimal loss of life. They can end everything here. And so Burgoyne gets the go-ahead. And ultimately what we have is Burgoyne trying to march up a force south out of Canada, being met with a British naval force under Howe coming up from New York City, and they never get to meet. In October of that year, Burgoyne's army is defeated in a series of battles, leading to the complete and total surrender of an entire British army to the Americans after the Battle of Saratoga. Burgoyne wasn't the world's greatest general, and you can read some really great historical research on the battle. It's easy to imagine New York today with its cities and thoroughfares and public roads. Imagine having to march several thousand men plus their wives, all their baggage, all their food, and all the supplies needed to support those men through a primeval forest that you need to make a road through as you march. Burgoyne's plan was doomed almost from the beginning, mainly by Burgoyne's own behavior. He had a wagon full of champagne because why not? You don't lead an uncivilized life in the middle of the American wilderness. It leads to his defeat. And this is probably the most momentous victory by the American army in the early part of the war, and we'll get that into a little bit. That winter, the army will go into winter quarters at Valley Forge. It will suffer in the early part of the winter one of the worst moments in one of the low tides in the American Revolution. Lack of supplies, lack of faith, lack of so much, and Washington will bring an army better organized and better trained out of Valley Forge than went into it. There will be defeats at Monmouth Courthouse after a major battle. It's essentially what we're doing here with the northern campaigns is we're seeing a war fought out cat and mouse style. Washington knows that as I have said before, that he cannot defeat the British head on. So what he has to do is he has to last. He has to win a victory through attrition, small little battles, bleeding the British army, but more importantly, bleeding out the British will to fight the Americans. Drag the war out long enough that ultimately the British stop. That is Washington's key to beating the British. So, as I said, Saratoga is this massive, important moment in the American Revolution. Saratoga is the point in time where the American army, the American forces prove on the battlefield that they can beat the British army on equal grounds. This isn't some surprise attack in New Jersey on Christmas morning. This is literally head-to-head classic 18th century combat in linear formations, a slugfest, just an absolute bloodbath. And the Americans are able to win. The Americans are able to beat the British at their own game. And this proves to France that the Americans may have a chance and that the Americans can be supported. And so on February 6, 1778, America, the United Colonies, and France will sign a treaty of alliance and a treaty of amity and commerce. So what does this mean? Amity and commerce means we're going to have friendship between the French and the American colonies. But the alliance means that militarily, the French will support the Americans. Commerce-wise, the colonies have very few things that the French want. They can get almost nothing out of the colonies right now because they're in the middle of a war and the British Navy rules the high seas. But now, militarily, the Americans have the French on their side. And if there is one thing the French love, it is going to war with the British, especially with a chance to beat them. We, in our modern age, sometimes forget that the British and the French spent most of the last 1,000 years actively looking for ways to kill each other. The American Revolution is a perfect moment for the French, who lost the French and Indian War and lost most of their lost almost all their land holdings in North America to the British, to get some of that stuff back and to really stick it to the British. Spain in 1779 will sign on. We'll get some troops. But mostly from Spain and the Dutch, we get money. You can't fight a war for free. You have to pay your troops. You have to feed your troops. You need bullets and ammunition. And while the French bring money and troops and ships and supplies, the Spanish and the Dutch make sure that we can pay for this revolution. And again, this isn't European allies stepping forward to say, we need to support this nascent democratic movement. They don't care about democracy. They want to see the British defeated militarily. They want the British to have their uppance come for once. But it's an important moment because honestly, this is the moment, this is the item that I won't say guarantees American independence, but helps secure American independence. There is no way we could have fought a war of attrition on our own without assistance and recognition. And this is the moment that gives us money, recognition, 20,000 reinforcements of the French Navy, and it gives the American colonies legitimacy. This isn't just a bunch of upstart rich dudes that are pissed off for so many reasons fighting against London. This is now a colonial state with international recognition taking on the British Empire. This is the moment that the war can become winnable. We've talked about the northern campaigns, and honestly, we need to remember that there's a northern campaign and a southern campaign. The first half of the war, by and large, is fought in New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania. The southern campaigns will start off later. We will literally see the British Army get on boats and go south about halfway through the war because they want to sneak around the Americans and find a way that they've heard they can get more support. But the first part of the Southern War takes place in Virginia in 1775. Lord Dunmore, the royal governor of Virginia, refuses to cooperate with the independence movement. He opposes independence. He is a strict royalist. He has his position because of his support of the crown. And what we have is a moment where Dunmore honestly screws things up so badly that he guarantees Virginia's support for the Massachusetts War by doing some really dumb things. First and foremost is the gunpowder incident. The capital is Williamsburg, and there's a powder magazine there. That's where all the gunpowder for the colonial militia is kept to be distributed as needed. Dunmore tries sneaking the gunpowder out of town. He says the colonists here in Virginia are getting excited. They're supporting these idiots in Massachusetts. We need to get the gunpowder away from them so that they don't hurt themselves or hurt other people, and maybe we can prevent this war from going on. That doesn't go well. It brings tensions to a head. And then in November of that year, Dunmore issues a proclamation. And the proclamation declares freedom for the slaves of those whose owners are in rebellion. And that if slaves abandon their owners who are in rebellion to go and support the British Army, to fight for the British Army, they will be given their freedom. This is the worst possible thing you can imagine in colonial Virginia. This makes the British response to revolution a slave rebellion. This is a slave-based economy, as our readings have talked about, as we've talked about in lectures so far this semester. To arm African American men to fight against white slave owners in rebellion against the government is to create a slave revolt that threatens white society in Virginia. He'll actually have enough slaves come and join his cause that he'll be able to field the Ethiopian regiment. There will be a few skirmishes, maybe one battle fought by the Ethiopian regiment in support of British forces, but by 1776, Dunmore and the regiment are forced from Virginia, but the damage is done because here we see again the official response by representatives of the British government is to force our slaves against us into open rebellion, only further solidifies the issue. So why did the British Army shift to the south? Honestly, after 1778, 1779, the North is seen as a stalemate. Washington has been able to bounce back and forth and to oppose where he can the British Army and their forces. He's been able to run like heck and get away from the British to prevent a battle when he doesn't want one. The British leadership don't see the North as a winnable war. It's going to be a cat and mouse war. So we need to bring this war to a quick conclusion. How do you do that? Let's go to an area that we have reports is more loyal than the South, or than the northern colonies. Obviously, Massachusetts started this whole darn thing. So let's go to where they didn't start the war, where they're probably more loyal, and we'll wrap that up next week, or the next time, pardon me, in the third lecture for the week, when we discuss the Southern Campaign and the end of the American Revolution. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys again soon.